Tonight, we journey into the frozen silence of the Haligtree. Snow drifts endlessly through the pale air, slow and weightless, like the world itself has forgotten how to hurry. The sky above is heavy and low, a dome of grey pressing down on the white earth. The sun is only a memory, hidden behind the clouds, and what little light reaches this place is cold and pale. No birds fly here, no animals stir. Only the wind moves, and even it seems tired, sliding quietly through the ruins of a place that time forgot, far from any road or village, beyond the paths that living feet dare to walk. The Haligtree rises. Its trunk is pale and scarred, and its branches stretch outward like weary arms, reaching for a sky that never answers. Its roots dig into the frozen ground, as if clinging to the last remnants of life. Once, this place was a dream of salvation, a promise of refuge, a sanctuary for the forsaken, a home for those cast aside by the rest of the lands between. But now, it is only a memory, wrapped in snow and silence. Beneath the tree lies Elphael, the city that sleeps. Its courtyards are drowned in ice. Its streets are swallowed by drifts of white. Stone walls, once proud and strong, are cracked and split by frost. Icicles hang like daggers from the broken eaves. Frozen fountains hold the reflections of a sky without color. The sound of water dripping from the high spires is the only heartbeat this city has left. And here, in this hollow of silence, stand the Haligtree Knights. They do not speak. They do not move. They do not sleep, and yet they do not live. Once, they were the pride of Miquella's vision. Their shields gleamed with gold. Their swords shone like morning light, and their armor caught the last warmth of the sun. They swore an oath to protect the tree, its queen, and the dream it promised. That dream has long since crumbled. The queen is gone, the tree withers, and the snow buries all memory of warmth. Still, the knights remain. Snow gathers on their pauldrons, piling on shoulders and helms, melting only when the weak sunlight brushes them for a fleeting hour. The wind whistles through the gaps in their armor, low and mournful, like a song for the dead. Their shields lean against shattered walls. Their swords sink slowly into the ice. Every flake of snow that lands upon them becomes part of their endless vigil. If you were to walk here, in the endless quiet of this winter tomb, your footsteps would be the only sound. Perhaps you would see the faint trace of boots frozen into the cobblestone, marks left by men who have not moved for years. Perhaps you would notice the frost clinging to the edges of their blades, turning steel into white bone. Perhaps you would feel the weight of the cold, the stillness pressing on your chest, as if the air itself has grown old. The Haligtree Knights are not ghosts, but they might as well be. Time flows differently here. The days are short and dim, and the nights are long and starless. Snow falls and melts and falls again. Seasons may change elsewhere, but here, beneath the Haligtree, it is always winter. The tree sleeps. The city sleeps. Even the echoes have grown tired. Once these walls knew laughter. Once these courtyards rang with the march of armored feet. Children played between the roots. Priests whispered prayers beneath the sacred branches, and Melania herself walked among her knights, silent but radiant, a living promise of hope. Miquella's dream was alive then, and these men were more than statues of frost and steel. They were guardians, brothers, and living souls. But that is gone now. Only snow, only wind, only the endless watch of nights who have forgotten what it means to live. If you listen closely, if you truly let the silence surround you, you might imagine the faint sound of their breathing. You might hear the creak of frozen leather, the rattle of a chain in the wind, the whisper of an oath sworn long ago. Perhaps you would hear a single voice, praying to a god that has long since turned away. But in truth, there is nothing here but the quiet. This is the lonely watch of the Haligtree Knights. And tonight, their story begins. Long before the snow fell, long before the wind grew cold, there was a dream. The Haligtree did not always stand in silence. Once, it was young. Its branches were thin and alive. Its roots trembled with the pulse of life, reaching deep into the earth, seeking the strength to hold a fragile hope. In those days, before frost claimed the courtyards, before time buried the walls in snow, this place was not yet a ruin. It was a vision, a whisper, a sanctuary waiting to be born. Miquella the kind, eternal youth and gentle twin of Melania, walked the lands between carrying a dream in his heart. He had seen the suffering of those abandoned by the Golden Order. He had walked through villages where Albinaurics hid in the shadows, through forests where misbegotten creatures cowered from hunters, through the lonely roads where small folk carried their grief in silence. He had seen a world that chose who deserved to live in the light and who would be left in the cold. He wished to change that, not with armies, not with fire, not with thrones or crowns, but with kindness. Miquella envisioned a place where the forsaken could gather, where the unwanted could finally rest. He dreamed of a tree, one that would stand as a symbol not of domination, but of protection. A tree that would bend toward the weak. A tree that would never turn anyone away. And so he planted a sapling. The story says it was born of his own magic, watered by his quiet hope, and nurtured with care that only a soul like his could give. It was a mirror to the Erd tree, but softer, paler, gentler. This one would not blind the world with golden light. It would not demand worship. It would simply exist for those who had nowhere else to go. As the sapling grew, so too did the whispers of its existence. They spread first among the Albinaurics, then to the wandering merchants, then to the small villages where people huddled in fear. Some said there was a place where no one would turn you away, a place where even the cursed could find peace, a place where a tree of pale light waited, and a lord with a gentle voice offered shelter. And so they came, through forests of fog, over rivers half frozen, through swamps where the mist never lifted, they came. Misbegotten Albinaurics, wandering souls with nowhere left to rest. Many were lost to the wilds or the cold, but those who arrived, they found the beginning of a dream. It was not a city yet, not even a village, just wooden scaffolds, a handful of huts, and the pale trunk of the Haligtree, its branches reaching toward the grey sky. But for those who had known only fear and rejection, it was enough. They knelt in the snow at the base of the tree. They touched the cold roots with trembling hands. They whispered thanks, even if they did not know to whom they prayed. And Miquella, gentle as ever, walked among them with soft eyes and softer words. He offered no crown. He demanded no fealty. Yet every soul that came here belonged to him, not through chains or law, but through love. And by his side, as always, was Melania. Melania, blade of Miquella, the undefeated daughter of Marika, the scarlet guardian whose name carried both fear and reverence. Here, beneath the boughs of the Haligtree, she was no conqueror. She was no terror of the battlefield. She was a shield. She was a sentinel. She was the unspoken promise that no harm would come to those who called this place home. The early days of the Haligtree were quiet. Snow fell in soft flurries. The wind hummed low songs through the branches. Albinauric children played between the roots, their small footprints vanishing under the gentle white blanket. Misbegotten, free from the scorn of the outside world, built walls from timber and stone, hands steady for the first time in their lives. Even wandering spirits seemed to linger here, drawn to the warmth of hope. At dusk, when the pale light of day faded into the long, cold night, the small community gathered under the tree. They lit braziers not for ritual, but for comfort. Shadows danced across the snow, and the people listened to Michela speak in his soft, patient voice. He told them that they were safe, that this tree would grow with them and for them, that no one here would ever be forsaken again. And so, for the first time in their lives, the lost believed. The Haligtree grew, and with it, the dream took shape. Days drifted like snowflakes, slow and soft. Time here moved differently, beyond the forests and mountains. The lands between raged with ambition and bloodshed, but beneath the pale boughs of the Haligtree, life flowed like a quiet stream. The world outside felt distant, like a fading echo of a story no one here wished to remember. The small settlement, once only scattered huts and wooden frames, began to transform. Stone replaced timber. Courtyards formed where the snow could settle in soft blankets. Walls rose around the heart of the sanctuary, not as a fortress to defy the world, but as gentle arms to hold back the cruel wind. Bridges spanned the gaps between towers, and beneath every arch, lanterns glowed like warm stars against the endless white. The Haligtree itself had grown stronger. Its trunk thickened, its pale bark etched with subtle patterns like veins of silver. The roots spread beneath the earth, reaching into the deep soil, carrying the pulse of life into the cold stone of the city. Its branches, though bare in winter, stretched higher with every season, as if refusing to bow to the sky's grey indifference. Miquella walked the streets often, not as a ruler, but as a brother among his people. He wore no crown, and his steps were quiet, but every soul that saw him felt the weight of his gentle presence. Children ran to him, their laughter a rare and fragile sound in the frozen air. Albinoric elders knelt when he passed, whispering prayers of thanks for a peace they had never known. Misbegotten craftsmen lifted their heads from their labor, their monstrous forms unhidden for the first time, and smiled. And beside him, as always, was Melania. She walked the walls, her golden hair a faint flame against the grey sky, her blade always at her side. She rarely spoke to the people, yet they felt safe because she was there. To them, she was not a goddess of war. She was a sentinel carved from their hope, a silent vow that no harm would breach these walls. The Haligtree Knights emerged in these days, born not of noble bloodlines or grand armies, but of loyalty. They were the willing, the steadfast, the ones who had found in this place something they could never abandon. Some were misbegotten, some were human, some were Albinorics barely strong enough to lift a sword. But each of them swore the same oath to guard the Haligtree, its people and its dream. At first, their armor was simple. Iron plates scavenged from the old wars, patched leather reinforced with whatever could be found. But as the settlement grew, so did the skill of its craftsmen. New armor was forged, polished until it caught the pale light like water. Shields bore the symbol of the Haligtree, a mark of quiet defiance in a world that had no mercy for them. Their days were steady and slow. At dawn, they patrolled the snowy courtyards, their boots crunching softly against the frost. At midday, they trained in silence, blades cutting arcs through the cold air. At dusk, they lit the braziers, their orange glow spilling over white stone, like the last warmth of a dying sun. And at night, they knelt beneath the tree, heads bowed, their whispered prayers rising like mist. Miquella sometimes watched them from the shadows of the branches. He saw in them the strength of his dream, not in their swords, but in their hearts. They were more than soldiers. They were living proof that kindness could take root, that even in a world as broken as the lands between, a fragile hope could survive, and for a time it seemed as if the dream would last forever. But dreams are fragile things. Beyond the white forests and frozen rivers, the world stirred with war. Rumors drifted into the sanctuary like cold wind. Whispers of lords clashing for power, of kingdoms burning, of the Golden Order faltering. Some refugees brought stories of Horus fields turned to graves, villages silenced in a single night, roads haunted by beasts and desperate men. The people of the Haligtree listened, their hearts trembling, but Miquella's voice calmed them. Here, he said, they were safe. Here, under the pale branches, the world could not reach them. The tree would hold, their faith would hold, but Melania felt the weight in the wind. She could not be soothed by hope alone. Her walks along the walls grew longer, her gaze sharper, her silence heavier. She sensed what others could not. The world would not allow this dream to last. But all dreams, no matter how gentle, eventually meet the world beyond their walls. The first signs were not armies. They were whispers carried by the cold wind. Refugees spoke of fires in the distance, of knights who once served gold and light, now turning to ash and blood, of beasts stalking the night roads, and of soldiers who wore no banners because they served only themselves. The Haligtree listened in silence. Its branches swayed in the grey sky. Its roots pressed deeper into the frozen earth. The tree could feel the world's breath, and it trembled. Then came the first absence. A patrol of misbegotten never returned. They had left at dawn, their laughter muffled by snow, their blades catching the soft morning light. By nightfall, the walls waited for their steps. By the next day, only silence returned. When they were found, days later, they were frozen into the snow like broken statues. Their faces locked in the final shape of fear, their swords still in hand, their blood already part of the ice. No words were spoken when their bodies were brought beneath the Haligtree. No cries, no wails, only the soft murmur of wind through the branches. Miquella's heart ached, but he did not show it. He still walked the courtyards with gentle steps, still touched the hands of the frightened and the lost. His voice was soft, but each word carried the weight of a vow. The tree will protect you. But Melania knew. The dream was no longer untouched. The world had found them. The first attacks were like shadows in the snow. A glint of steel at the edge of the woods. An arrow buried in a wall. The echo of a horn. So faint it could have been a trick of the wind. The Haligtree Knights moved to answer. They doubled their patrols, their boots leaving fresh lines in the endless white. They sharpened their blades, their breath clouding the frozen air. Every night, they knelt beneath the boughs, praying in silence, their voices barely rising above the sound of snow falling on stone. Then the first battle came. It was not grand or glorious. It was a whisper of war, small and cruel. A band of intruders crossed the outer forest, faces hidden under fur and iron. The knights met them at the edge of the trees. Steel sang softly, and blood spilled into the snow like ink on parchment. When the wind carried the smell of death into the city, the people of the Haligtree lowered their heads. The dream trembled, but it endured. The survivors of the skirmish returned to the walls, their armor stained, their silence heavier than any victory song. They took their posts again. They watched the forests again. And still, each night, they knelt. Seasons shifted, though here it was always winter. Snow fell and melted and fell again, erasing the tracks of both the living and the dead. The city grew quieter. The laughter of the children faded into whispers. Even the braziers seemed to burn softer, as if light itself feared to disturb the silence. Melinia walked the walls alone. Her footsteps were soft, but every one of them carried the weight of dread. She could feel the pull of the world beyond the forest. The wars of gods and lords had long arms, and no tree, no matter how holy or pure, could hide from them forever. One night, as the snow fell in heavy sheets, a knight stood at the gate long after his watch had ended. He stared into the dark of the woods, his breath slow and white. He thought he saw shapes moving in the distance. He thought he heard the echo of a horn. But when he blinked, there was only snow. The Haligtree slept. The city slept. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But the world was coming, and the knights, they could only wait. They were not born knights. They were born from need, from hope, and from the quiet dream of a forgotten tree. The Haligtree Knights were unlike any other order in the lands between. They were not chosen from noble bloodlines. They were not forged in the halls of kings. They came from the broken, the wandering, and the unwanted. Each one had walked through snow and shadow to find the sanctuary beneath the Haligtree. Each one had knelt in the cold, feeling the roots under their hands, and swore a silent promise: I will not leave this place. In the beginning, there were only a few. Men with weary faces, women who had lost everything, Albinorics who had survived the hunt, and misbegotten who had never been given a name. They stood together in the courtyard, snow catching in their hair, their breath rising in pale clouds. They had no armor, no banners, no songs. Yet Miquella looked upon them as if they were already heroes. He did not speak like a lord. He did not command them as soldiers. He only asked, "Will you guard this tree? Will you keep safe those who cannot protect themselves?" And they answered, "Not with cheers, not with horns or fanfare, but with silence. The silence of devotion that does not need words." The first days of their vigil were humble. They wore what they could find: patchwork armor, old shields scavenged from forgotten battlefields, and blades that bore the nicks and scars of other wars. They were clumsy at first, a handful of lost souls learning to stand as one. Their drills were simple. Their watch was long. The snow became their companion, the wind their song, and the Haligtree their only witness. At dawn, they rose from small fires, shaking frost from their cloaks. Their boots crunched softly against the frozen stone. As they walked the outer paths of the city, they moved in pairs, always listening, always watching. By midday, they gathered in the courtyard, their breaths forming a ghostly mist as they trained. Wooden dummies cracked under their strikes. Old shields clanged in slow, deliberate rhythm. There were no shouts, no war cries, only the soft music of effort in the cold air. At dusk, they lit the braziers along the walls. Orange light flickered across white stone, casting long shadows that swayed like spirits in the snow. The city would seem almost alive in that moment, its empty windows glowing faintly, as if the warmth of the night's duty had reached the forgotten corners of Elphael. And when night came, they knelt beneath the Haligtree. The ritual of prayer was simple. No one spoke. No one asked for glory. The knights simply placed a hand upon the roots, feeling the cold of the tree seep into their skin. They closed their eyes, listening to the wind moving through the branches. And for a brief moment, they felt as though the Haligtree itself was breathing with them. This was their bond. This was their oath. not to a throne, not to a crown, not even to life itself, but to the tree, to the people under its branches, and to the dream Miquella had planted here. So began the brotherhood of the Haligtree Knights. There were no titles, no ranks, only trust, only the silent understanding that every man and woman who bore a shield for the Haligtree was part of a single heartbeat. The first winter passed, then another, and the nights endured. They learned to move through the snow like shadows, their cloaks blending into the endless white. They learned to read the language of the wind, to hear danger in the faintest crack of a branch, and slowly the people came to believe in them. To the refugees, they were more than gods. They were symbols, living proof that this sanctuary was real, that kindness could survive in a world that had long since forgotten it. And to the knights themselves, every night spent beneath the tree, every morning they rose to the cold, was another word in the vow they carried silently in their hearts: I will never abandon this place. Even if the world forgets it, the days of the Haligtree Knights were long, but they passed like snow, silent, uncounted, and forgotten by the world. Their lives followed a rhythm that was both simple and sacred. From the first pale light of dawn to the last hush of night, they lived in service to the dream of Miquella. Their bodies moved, their blades sang, but their souls were quiet, bound to the tree and to each other. Dawn. The cold bit deepest in the first light of morning. Frost painted every surface in white crystals, and the braziers of the night smouldered in faint embers. Knights rose from their bedrolls or narrow bunks, breath curling into the air like ghosts. They did not speak. They had no need to. One by one, they emerged into the courtyards. Their armor clinked softly, muted by layers of cloth and frost. Snow crunched under boots as they walked the walls, checking gates, scanning the endless white of the forest beyond. In those hours, the world felt suspended. The sun, weak and pale, rose slowly behind clouds that never truly broke. It lit the city in silver, turning icicles into shards of glass, turning the snow into a blanket that seemed to glow. Some knights began their day in the armory, scraping rust from swords, oiling the hinges of shields and pauldrons. Others began in motion, stretching frozen muscles, swinging wooden swords in slow arcs to wake the strength in their arms. Midday. By the time the sun reached its faintest peak, the knights gathered for their drills. They moved in rows, their breath rising in synchronized clouds. Blades cut the air in patterns repeated 1,000 times, shields lifted and lowered in perfect rhythm. There were no shouted commands, no clashing of steel for glory, only the steady whisper of movement, the muted thud of boots on snow, and the quiet chime of metal in the cold. Some practiced archery at the edge of the walls, their arrows sinking into targets of frozen straw. Others walked the forest's edge, listening to the wind, reading the silence for signs of danger. Every patrol left its story in the snow, lines of footprints winding between trees, sometimes alone, sometimes paired, always returning to the gates as the day aged. Dusk. When the light began to fade, the city changed. Shadows stretched across the courtyards, and the cold deepened like water filling a basin. The knights lit the braziers one by one. The flames rose with a soft hiss, and the snow around them turned orange for a moment, before swallowing the light in reflection. From the walls, the city seemed to float in darkness, its glowing points like stars fallen to earth. The wind carried the smell of smoke and pine. Sometimes it carried the distant howl of wolves, and the knights would pause, listening, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. In those moments, they felt the weight of their oath most deeply. It was not the warmth of the fire that comforted them. It was the presence of each other. A line of silent guardians watching a world that had forgotten their names. Night. The final ritual of each day was always the same. When the city grew still, and the only sounds were the soft hiss of wind and the occasional pop of firewood, the knights gathered beneath the Haligtree. They removed their helmets. Frost clung to their hair and lashes. Their breath rose together in clouds that drifted into the branches. No one spoke. No one asked for anything. They knelt, each placing a hand upon the roots, feeling the cold pulse of the tree through the earth. Some swore they could feel a faint heartbeat in the bark, slow and steady, like the world itself was breathing. In that silence, their vow renewed itself without a word. It was not written. It was not spoken. It lived in the spaces between heartbeats. I will watch. I will protect. I will endure. Then, one by one, they rose and returned to their posts, vanishing into the night like shadows. Days became weeks. Weeks became seasons. But to the Haligtree Knights, it was all the same. Snow fell, snow melted. Snow fell again, and still they watched. Still they knelt. Still they endured. For theirs was not a duty measured in victories or years. It was a duty measured in silence, and the silence of the Haligtree was deep and endless. An oath is not always spoken. Sometimes it is lived, in the quiet between heartbeats. The oath of the Haligtree Knights was unlike any other in the lands between. Most knights swore to kings, to crowns, to thrones of gold and stone. They swore to lords who could fall, to kingdoms that could burn, to laws that could break with the changing of the wind. But the Haligtree Knights swore to something quieter, something older, something that did not care for power or glory. They swore to a dream. The day of their oath was never marked by celebration. There were no horns, no banners, no feasts. A knight of the Haligtree became what they were, in the same silence that filled the city's frozen streets. When a soul arrived at the Haligtree, drawn by whispers of a sanctuary, they first knelt in the snow. They placed their hands upon the roots and felt the cold seep into their skin, as if the tree were testing their resolve. Miquella would sometimes be there, his presence soft and unassuming. He did not speak grand words. He would simply watch, his eyes filled with quiet knowing. If the soul before him could remain in that stillness, unshaken by the weight of the cold and the silence, then they would rise and join the watch. Their oath was simple. It did not require language. It lived in the rhythm of their breath, in the steady beat of their heart, and in the steps they would take along the snowy walls for the rest of their lives. I will watch, I will protect, I will endure. The meaning of the oath was deeper than duty. It was not only a promise to defend the people of the Haligtree. It was a surrender of the self. A knight of the Haligtree belonged no longer to the world, but to the tree, to the snow, to the silent dream that bound them all together. Some knights had families among the refugees. Some had children who played in the shadow of the walls. But even for them, the oath came first. There was no greater honor than to be part of the silent line that held the darkness at bay. The oath also carried an unspoken weight. It was a vow that might never be fulfilled in glory. There would be no songs for the Haligtree Knights, no bards to sing their names, no cities to honor them. If they fell, they would fall in the snow, and the snow would cover them. Perhaps in time, even the tree would forget, and yet, not one of them wavered. Life as a Haligtree Knight was a meditation on patience and devotion. Every movement was part of their vow. When they polished their armor, it was a prayer. When they walked the walls, it was a hymn. When they knelt beneath the branches, their silence was a psalm to the dream they guarded. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, a knight would feel a presence at their shoulder. They would not turn to see it. They would not speak. They would only breathe and know that the Haligtree itself was listening. Melania often watched them from the shadows. She did not command them, for they needed no orders. She simply observed, her expression unreadable, her single eye reflecting the faint orange of the braziers. She knew the price of their oath, and she bore it with them in silence. Years passed like drifting snow. Nights came and went, though. Went was rarely by choice. Some fell to illness. Some fell in the forest beyond the walls. And some simply faded, their bodies finally giving way to the cold, their hearts having beaten every last beat for the dream. When a knight died, there was no ceremony. Their brothers and sisters would lift the body with care, carry it beneath the Haligtree, and lay it at the roots. There, the snow would claim it, and the tree would take its silent offering. The living knights did not mourn aloud. They only knelt a little longer that night, their breaths rising like pale smoke in the darkness, their hearts whispering the vow again, I will watch, I will protect, I will endure. This was the life of the Haligtree Knights. Not glory, not triumph, only devotion, as endless and cold as the snow that fell upon their shoulders. An oath can outlive the body. An oath can become all that remains. For the Haligtree Knights, the oath was not only a duty. It was a transformation. It changed the way they breathed, the way they moved, the way they thought. A knight of the Haligtree was no longer an individual. They were a shadow in the snow, a whisper in the wind, a living fragment of Miquella's dream. The self melted away like frost beneath the pale winter sun. All that remained was the oath. The weight of the oath grew heavier with time. At first, the knights believed their vigil would be a bridge to a brighter day. They thought the world would leave them in peace, that the sanctuary beneath the Haligtree would grow strong enough to withstand even the cruelty of the lands between. But as the years passed, and the whispers of distant war became louder, hope began to wane. The oath became their anchor. It was what kept their hands steady and their hearts from breaking. When the forest beyond the walls fell silent for too long, or when the snow seemed to bury the world in white oblivion. In that endless winter, routine was their salvation. Dawn patrols, silent training, lighting the braziers, kneeling at the roots. Each act was a prayer. Each step was a promise. Each breath was a reminder that they had given themselves completely to this place. And slowly, the oath became something more than words in the heart. It became a chain that bound them to the Haligtree, beyond life itself. Some said that when a knight died on the walls, their spirit would linger. Not out of fear, not out of unfinished business, but because their vow had no end. It was in the way the wind sometimes carried the faint echo of armor, even when no one walked the walls. It was in the way the snow settled on a courtyard and seemed to form the shape of kneeling figures. It was in the way travelers claimed they felt unseen eyes upon them, long before a living knight appeared. The Haligtree Knights had become part of the sanctuary. Its silence was their silence. Its breath was their breath. Its memory was their only legacy. Melania knew this better than anyone. She often walked the courtyards at night, her armor faintly aglow in the firelight, her footsteps the only sound in the sleeping city. She would pass the kneeling figures of the knights, their heads bowed, their hands resting upon the frozen roots. She never interrupted them. She never spoke. Sometimes, she would pause at the base of the tree and place her hand on the same root they touched. For a moment, it was as if she too had become part of the oath. The weight of eternity pressed upon them all. Knights aged. Armor rusted. Snow buried the marks of their footsteps. But still, the oath held. When a knight fell in battle or to the cold, their body was carried with reverence to the roots of the Haligtree. The surviving knights would kneel in a circle, silent as the wind moved between the branches. No words were spoken. No graves were dug. The snow would cover them, and the tree would remember. And the next day, the watch continued. The vow of the Haligtree Knights was simple, but it was endless. I will watch. I will protect. I will endure. These words, unspoken, became the heartbeat of the city. A rhythm that continued long after songs had faded, long after laughter had vanished, long after the world had forgotten the names of those who kept it alive. The oath was their life. The oath was their death. And the oath was their eternity. So they stood, snow gathering on their shoulders, wind singing in their ears, and silence filling every corner of their hearts. The world beyond the forest did not know their names. It did not care for their vigil. It would not honor them in story or in song. But under the pale boughs of the Haligtree, none of that mattered. Here, they belonged to something greater than themselves. Here, they had found a home that would never ask for glory, only for patience and for the quiet strength to never let the dream die. All things fade. Even dreams, if you wait long enough, turn to silence. The Haligtree had known peace for many winters. Its roots had felt the warmth of life. Its branches had heard the laughter of children and the soft prayers of the faithful. But peace is fragile, and in the lands between, it is always borrowed. The first signs of the dream's decay were not loud. They came quietly, like a slow breath leaving the world. The snow grew heavier, falling in thicker veils that muffled every sound. The wind carried a sharper bite, its voice no longer gentle, but hollow, echoing against the stone of the walls and the wooden beams of the houses. The days grew shorter, their pale light fading sooner behind unbroken clouds, while the nights seemed endless. The braziers struggled to keep their flames alive, their lights small and trembling against the vast winter dark. The people of the Haligtree still lived their lives. They fetched water from frozen wells, their hands red and raw from the cold. They mended clothes by candlelight, the glow of small flames flickering against walls of stone. They lit fires where they could, yet the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it was born. Their voices grew softer. Laughter became rare. Even the footsteps of children in the courtyards seemed hesitant, as if the snow itself asked for silence. Every sound in the city felt fragile, like it might shatter if it was too loud. The knights felt it first. A weight in the air, a heaviness in their chests as they walked the walls. They scanned the horizon for movement, for any sign that the world beyond the forest had remembered them. The forests were still, the rivers were frozen. Only the wind moved, trailing long sighs through the branches of the Haligtree. At night, when they knelt beneath the roots, the silence was heavier than ever before. The wind whispered through the branches like a warning. The roots beneath their hands were cold, colder than they remembered. The tree itself seemed to sleep more deeply, its presence distant, its strength fading with the light. Some knights exchanged glances in the quiet of their patrols, but none spoke of the feeling. Their oath had no words for fear. Then came the first true loss. A patrol left at dawn. 6 knights in white cloaks, their armor faintly gleaming in the pale sun. They walked into the forest, their boots leaving neat tracks in the snow, and soon vanished between the silent trees. By dusk, the sky darkened. The wind began to rise, bringing with it the taste of ice. That night, a blizzard swallowed the world. The walls shook under the howl of the storm, and the city huddled in darkness, waiting for the sound of returning footsteps that never came. 3 days passed. On the 4th, a search party followed the trail through the snow. The forest was silent. The only sound was the crunch of boots, the soft hiss of breath, and the occasional whisper of branches shedding their weight of snow. Then, in a clearing, they found them. The 6 knights knelt as if in prayer. Their hands still gripped the hilts of their swords. Their armor was white with frost. Their eyes stared at the sky, glass-like and still. No blood marked the snow. No enemy tracks surrounded them. It was as if the cold itself had claimed them in silence. They were carried back slowly, their bodies heavy with ice. The gates opened without a word. The people watched from doorways, their faces pale, their breath clouding in the cold air. At the roots of the Haligtree, the knights were laid down one by one. The living knelt in a circle around them, their breaths rose in pale clouds, mingling with the falling snow. No words were spoken. No prayers were said aloud. The silence was the prayer. The snow would cover them. The tree would remember. From that day forward, the city felt different. The cold seemed sharper. The walls seemed thinner. Even the Haligtree itself, once a symbol of gentle hope, looked wary. Its branches trembled in the wind. Its roots felt brittle beneath the hands of the knights. The faint hum of life that once pulsed beneath the bark felt weaker. Now, as if the dream itself was fading. Miquella still walked the courtyards. His presence calmed the frightened hearts of the people, but his steps were slower, his voice softer. He touched the heads of children, spoke gentle words to the Albinoric elders, and let the cold settle on his own shoulders, as if he could bear it for them. Melinia said nothing. She spent more time on the walls, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her hand never far from the hilt of her blade. Sometimes she walked the forest paths at dusk, vanishing into the white, returning only when night had fully claimed the city. Her armor was always dusted with frost. The Haligtree Knights followed her example. They lengthened their patrols. They prayed longer at night. They spoke less than ever. And all the while, the silence deepened. It felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. The silence did not last forever. The world beyond the forest had remembered them. It began with whispers in the wind. Travelers and refugees spoke of distant wars, of villages swallowed by fire, of lords who sent out their soldiers not for justice, but for conquest. The lands between were unraveling. For a time, the Haligtree seemed untouchable. Its snow choke paths were hidden, its walls veiled in white silence. But no sanctuary can hide from the world forever. The first signs of intrusion were subtle. A single arrow lodged in the outer wall, a line of footprints in the snow that did not belong to the knights. A flicker of shadow between the trees. The Haligtree Knights moved without hesitation. They doubled the patrols. They lit more braziers along the walls. And at night, they prayed longer beneath the roots, as if their silence could hold the world at bay. But silence cannot stop war. One night, a faint horn sounded in the distance. It was soft, almost swallowed by the wind, yet every night on the wall froze. The sound was foreign, alien in a place that had known only the music of snow and wind. The horn fell silent. Then the forest moved. Dark shapes emerged from the tree line, half hidden in the swirl of snow. There was no shouted challenge, no roar of attack. Only the slow, deliberate advance of figures who had come to test the dream. The Haligtree Knights met them at the gates. Steel whispered against scabbards. Boots pressed into the snow. The first clash was quiet, as if even the battle feared to disturb the sacred stillness of the city. A sword struck a shield with a muted thud. An arrow hissed through the dark. A knight exhaled in a cloud of white breath as he fell to his knees. When the skirmish ended, the snow drank its first blood in years. The attackers fled, leaving no bodies behind. Only bloodstains, scattered arrows, and the breathless figures of the knights returning to their posts. They did not speak of it. They simply resumed their vigil, their faces unreadable beneath the frost. The people of the Haligtree felt the change in the air. They moved more quietly. Their fires burned lower, their eyes lingered longer on the walls. Even the children sensed it. The weight of danger pressing against the gates. The kind of danger that waited patiently in the dark. The second attack came with the setting sun. Snow fell in soft sheets, turning the world into a pale blur. Through that blur, the enemy moved, silent, shadowed, a smear of black and steel against the white. This time, the clash was sharper. Blades rang against blades. Sparks flickered like fireflies in the winter night. The braziers along the wall shone like islands of gold in a sea of frost, illuminating fleeting glimpses of combat. A knight driving back a figure in ragged armor. An enemy crumpling silently into the snow. Another knight falling, his shield slipping from his hand, his body vanishing into the white. When the forest swallowed the last of the attackers, the walls were quieter than before. 5 knights had fallen. Their bodies were carried to the roots of the Haligtree, where the snow would remember them. The survivors knelt longer that night. Their hands lingered on the frozen roots. Some felt the pulse of the tree, faint and slow, like the last heartbeat of a fading dream. As the days passed, the attacks continued, never in great numbers, never enough to break the walls, but always there, always testing, always chipping away at the fragile peace that remained. The knights endured. Their armor grew heavier with ice. Their swords dulled at the edges. Their eyes became distant, haunted by the memory of white snow stained red. The people endured, but the city felt emptier with each passing week. Windows stayed shuttered. Fires burned small. Voices spoke in whispers. And through it all, the Haligtree watched. Its branches trembled in the wind. Its roots slept beneath the snow. Perhaps it knew. Perhaps it grieved. Or perhaps it, too, had grown weary. In the stillness after the third attack, a single knight lingered on the wall. Long after the others had gone, snow gathered on his shoulders. His breath rose in slow, steady clouds. He stared into the forest, where the darkness between the trees seemed to shift and breathe. He thought of his oath. He thought of the dream. And he wondered, though he would never say it aloud, if even dreams could freeze to death. The fall of a dream is rarely sudden. It happens slowly, like snow piling on a branch until it finally breaks. The Haligtree endured. Through each winter storm, through every whisper of shadow beyond the forest, it endured. But endurance is not the same as survival. The weight of time had begun to press heavily on the dream, and no dream can bear such weight forever. The city beneath the branches was changing. What was once a sanctuary, soft and bright with the warmth of hope, was now a hushed tomb of flickering firelight. The courtyards, once alive with the steps of children and the measured tread of knights, lay buried under thick snow. Icicles hung like teeth from the broken eaves of stone houses. Frost clung to every surface, turning the city into a sculpture of white and silver. The few who lived here moved like ghosts. The Albinaurics, fragile and bent, wore layers of cloth that barely kept the cold from their bones. Their laughter, once light and strange, had vanished entirely. They walked with heads down, eyes on the snow, as if afraid to look too far into the silence. The misbegotten, who had once built the walls and patrolled the streets with pride, now bore the weight of exhaustion, their strong backs hunched under invisible burdens. Some carried wood for the last fires. Some carried the fallen. They spoke little, their deep voices reduced to whispers in the cold air. Even the human refugees, who had once filled the courtyards with life, now lingered near shuttered windows. Frost rimmed the glass. Candles burned behind them like small stars in the endless night. The city felt hollow. Even when people moved, it was as if the snow swallowed their presence, erasing the sound of their steps before it could travel far. The Haligtree Knights endured, but their duty had become a weight heavier than steel or frost. Their armor was coated in ice. Leather straps stiffened and cracked in the cold. Blades dulled from constant battle and relentless storms. Boots split along their seams, and the snow bit at their feet through the cracks. Some knights still walked their patrols with steady resolve. Others stood like statues for hours, barely moving, their eyes fixed on the forest, as if willing it to remain still. At times, they appeared less like living men and women, and more like frozen guardians, carved from the very winter around them. At night, they knelt beneath the Haligtree. Their hands touched the roots, but the roots felt colder now, and the faint heartbeat they once swore they felt was gone, or too faint to be heard. Their prayers were not for glory, nor for victory. They were for endurance, for one more day, for the strength to remain standing, even as the dream around them faded into white oblivion. Then came the winter of hunger. The storms were endless that year. Snow piled higher than the walls, drifting into alleys and burying doors. The forests beyond the city were impassable, and the rivers froze solid. The wind howled without pause, rattling shutters and howling through cracks in the stone. Food grew scarce. Hunting was impossible in the storms, and even if the knights had dared to venture deep into the forest, they knew the shadows there were watching. The people rationed what little remained. Thin soups, hard bread frozen by the air, before it could reach their lips. The knights gave what they had to the civilians first. Some went without meals for days, standing their watch on empty stomachs, their only sustenance the bitter wind and the snow they let melt on their tongues. One by one, the weakest began to fall. First the elders, who had survived so much only to be claimed by the cold. Then the children, whose small frames could not endure the hunger. The city grew quieter with each passing day. The sound of crying vanished, then the sound of laughter, then even the sound of conversation. The dead were carried to the roots of the Haligtree. There were no burials, for the earth was frozen solid. Instead, the fallen were left beneath the branches, where the snow would cover them, and the tree, silent and wary, would remember. The knights did not weep. They did not speak. They only knelt longer each night, their breaths rising in pale clouds, their hearts repeating the oath in silence: I will watch. I will protect. I will endure. Even in this deepening despair, the attacks did not stop. Shadows still moved between the trees. Footprints appeared in the snow where no patrol had walked. Sometimes, an arrow would strike a wall and vanish into the white. Sometimes, lifeblood would bloom against the snow, without warning, without sound. One night, a storm howled through the city, erasing the horizon in an endless sheet of white. 8 knights stood along the north wall. When the storm cleared the next morning, their posts were empty. The gates were closed. No bodies were found. Their tracks led into the forest, and then simply ended. For 3 days, search parties scoured the snow. They found no armor, no weapons, no blood. Only the stillness of a world that had decided to keep its secrets. The dream was dying. The Haligtree, once a beacon of quiet hope, now looked skeletal and weak. Its pale branches trembled like the hands of an old man. Its roots felt brittle beneath the touch of the last remaining knights. The hum of life within it was faint, like a heartbeat fading into sleep. And yet, the Haligtree Knights endured. Even as the world buried them in snow, even as hunger and silence pressed on their souls, they held their vow in the stillness. I will watch. I will protect. I will endure. All dreams end. Even those guarded by the most loyal hearts. The Haligtree stood in silence. Its pale branches reached toward the grey sky, but no light touched them anymore. Snow had buried the city to its knees. Doors were half, hidden under white drifts, and windows looked out into a world of endless frost. The streets that had once carried footsteps, and the courtyards that had once echoed with laughter, were empty. Only the wind moved through them now, singing a low, mournful song through the cracks in the stone. The Haligtree Knights still endured, fewer now, their numbers thinned by hunger, by the cold, and by the shadows that stalked the forest. But those who remained stood their watch as they always had. They rose at dawn, their bodies stiff with frost. Their armor clinked with a brittle, icy sound. They walked the walls, boots sinking deep into the snow, eyes scanning the horizon where white met grey, and the forest whispered its secrets. Sometimes they saw shapes in the distance. Sometimes they heard faint horns on the wind. But often there was nothing. Nothing but the cold. Nothing but the snow. Nothing but the slow fading of a world that no longer remembered them. The city below them had grown silent. Fires rarely burned anymore. Houses were sealed by snow and ice. Their windows dark, their doors unmoving. The few souls who remained moved like ghosts through the alleys, leaving no tracks when the storms came again. Even the Albinaurics had grown quiet as stone. Some never woke from their last sleep. The misbegotten, who had once labored with pride, now leaned against walls, their bodies too heavy with hunger to rise. One by one, the people were claimed by the winter. And one by one, the knights carried them to the roots of the Haligtree, laying them in the snow without words, without song, because silence had become their only language. The attacks slowed as the city died. Perhaps the world beyond the forest no longer saw reason to fight what was already lost. Perhaps the shadows that hunted them simply waited for the snow to finish its work. Still, the last knights held their vigil. At night, they knelt beneath the tree, their hands on the roots, their breaths rising in slow clouds. The pulse of the Haligtree, once faint but steady, was now all but gone. It felt like touching stone, cold, still, silent, and yet they swore the oath again, because the oath was all they had left. I will watch. I will protect. I will endure. Even as the dream they guarded was already gone, the final winter came without warning. A storm unlike any they had ever known rolled out of the mountains, blotting out the sky for days. Snow fell in unbroken sheets, burying walls, gates, and homes. The wind howled so loud that the knights could not hear their own footsteps. One by one, they vanished into the white. Some fell on the walls. their bodies frozen in the stance of their vigil. Some collapsed in the courtyards, snow already covering their armor before their hearts stopped. And some walked into the storm and were never seen again. When the storm passed, the Haligtree slept. The city was gone, a skeleton of stone beneath a sea of white. The walls were half buried. The gates hung open, creaking softly in the wind. And the knights, what remained of them, stood frozen in place, their bodies stiff and pale, their armor sheathed in ice. Some still held their swords. Some still knelt at the roots. Their faces were hidden beneath snow, but their silence spoke the vow louder than any voice ever could. Years would pass. Snow would fall and melt and fall again. The world would forget the Haligtree. Travelers might one day find the ruins, but they would not know the names of the knights or the dream they had died to protect. All they would see were frozen figures, half buried in white, silent and eternal. The Haligtree Knights had kept their oath. They had watched. They had protected. They had endured, until the world itself grew quiet around them. Silence is not the end. In silence, memory lingers. The Haligtree slept. Its branches, pale and brittle, reached toward a sky of endless gray. Its roots were buried deep beneath layers of frozen earth and snow, carrying no warmth, no pulse, only the memory of what had been. The city of Elphael lay beneath it, hollow and white, a skeleton of stone and ice, walls half buried, bridges broken, windows dark and lifeless. Snow covered all. It softened the sharp edges of ruin, turned death into a gentle curve of white drifts, and swallowed the last traces of human hands. But not all traces. The Haligtree Knights remained. They stood along the walls, frozen in their posts. They knelt beneath the tree, their hands still resting on the roots, as if in eternal prayer. Some leaned against the gates, their armor coated in frost, their swords buried in the snow. Time had claimed their breath, their warmth, their voices. But it had not claimed their vow. To a wandering eye, they might seem like statues, part of the ruin, their story long ended. But to the wind, to the snow, to the quiet memory of the Haligtree itself, they were still alive, not in body, not in name, but in purpose. Years passed. Seasons in the lands between shifted, though here, beneath the shadow of the Haligtree, it was always winter. Snow fell. Snow melted. Snow fell again. Travelers rarely came this way. The paths through the forest were treacherous, and the storms showed no mercy. Those who found the city often stumbled upon it by accident. A half-buried gate in the snow, a wall jutting from a drift like the rib of a dead giant. When they entered, they found silence. No voices. No movement. Only the sound of their own breath and the whisper of wind through hollow streets. Some told stories of the figures they saw in the snow, frozen knights, kneeling as if in prayer. Others said they heard the faint echo of armor, clinking in the distance, though no one walked the walls. No one stayed long. The city was too quiet, too cold, too heavy with memory. The world beyond the Haligtree moved on. Wars were fought. Kingdoms rose and fell. The names of lords and knights who had filled those bloody histories were spoken, celebrated, and forgotten. But the Haligtree Knights, they remained. Even in death, their vigil endured. They were not remembered in songs. No chronicles spoke of their sacrifice. Their names were lost, their faces hidden beneath frost. But the snow remembered. The tree remembered. The silence remembered. And in that remembrance, their legacy lived on. Some dreams die quietly. Others leave an echo that lingers in snow, wind, and silence. The Haligtree's echo lived in the snow. It drifted in the wind, soft as a whisper, carrying the memory of an oath older than any crown or kingdom. even as the world forgot the names of the knights. Their vow remained, woven into the frozen air, a song only the wind could hear. Travelers who found the path to the Haligtree often did so by accident. They wandered through the forest in storms, their senses dulled by hunger and cold, until they glimpsed the pale outline of walls half buried in white. To some, it was a mirage. To others, a curse. But to the few who dared to step inside, it was like entering a cathedral of ice and silence. The first thing they felt was weight. Not the weight of snow, nor of the cold air that clung to their lungs, but a weight in the soul, a heaviness that came from being surrounded by memory. The streets were silent. No voices, no footsteps. Only the sound of wind weaving through hollow alleys, singing a slow, mournful hymn. Then they saw the figures. Knights, frozen in time. Some stood upon the walls, their swords raised as if still ready to defend. Some leaned against the gates, their armor sheathed in frost. And some knelt at the roots of the Haligtree, hands resting on the wood, heads bowed in eternal prayer. To the untrained eye, they seemed like statues, carved by some forgotten hand from ice and iron. But those who lingered too long felt something deeper, a presence, a pulse of devotion that had outlived flesh and bone. Scholars who came seeking truth spoke of the whispers. Sometimes, when the wind was still, you could hear the faint clink of armor, the slow creak of leather straps, or the sound of boots pressing into snow. And yet no living knight remained. One scholar, who later vanished into the storm, wrote in his journal, "They are here. I cannot see them move, but they are here. They watch. They remember, and in their silence they keep the dream alive." As decades passed, snow buried the city deeper. Walls became smooth, white slopes. Bridges became ridges of ice. Houses disappeared entirely, their doors and windows sealed in frozen tombs. But beneath it all, the knights endured. Some were buried fully in the snow, their armor hidden, their swords entombed. Others still protruded from the drifts, half-visible guardians, hands locked on hilts, faces hidden under pale helmets. Time forgot them. But the silence remembered. On rare days, when the storm clouds broke, pale sunlight touched the city. The light fell on the knights like a blessing. It turned the snow into a sea of glittering diamonds, and the frozen armor into relics of silver and gold. If a traveler stood very still in that light, they could almost imagine the city alive again. Knights marching along the walls in slow rhythm, children running in the courtyards. Fires flickering in windows, casting soft warmth against the endless white. And then, as the sun sank behind the horizon, the vision would fade, leaving only the truth. A city of silence, guarded by ghosts that refused to fall. The legacy of the Haligtree Knights is not written in songs. It is not etched in stone or gold. It lives in silence. In the vow they carried beyond death, in the eternal, frozen moment of devotion that the world chose to forget, but the Haligtree chose to keep. And perhaps one day, when the snow melts and the wind softens, a wanderer will place their hand upon the roots. Perhaps they will feel it, the echo of 1,000 unspoken voices. I will watch, I will protect, I will endure, and in that moment, the dream of the Haligtree will awaken again.